So I want to talk about Bitcoin obituaries because it's funny and we can learn something. An obituary, of course, is when you announce the death of something or someone, usually someone. Bitcoin has died 477 times. Sometimes I'll just go and look up one of these and think about the context at the time and chuckle to myself. So we're going to learn something about critical thinking and Bitcoin and also laugh at some foolish people along the way. First Bitcoin obituary. So Bitcoin is announced in late 2008. Genesis block is mined January 2009. December 2010, we get the first Bitcoin obituary. Bitcoin is 23 cents. First Bitcoin transaction where someone exchanged Bitcoin for goods and services, famously, is 2 medium Papa John pizzas, 10,000 Bitcoin. That's May 2010. So 7 months later, Bitcoin had a good run, so long. And then Bitcoin goes up by a multiple of more than 10 by May 2011, but Bitcoin will fail. And one of the things you'll notice as we go through these obituaries is that the price keeps going up. So here's one of the more recent Bitcoin obituaries. This is April 17th, 2024. I'm calling the Bitcoin top. It happened in October 2021. At the peak of the money printing, it's over. So one of the things you'll notice about people, if you try to sort of figure out who is most likely to write a Bitcoin obituary, one of the strongest correlations is someone who has previously written a Bitcoin obituary at a much lower price. So we go from April 17th, 2024 back to November 2022. Same person, mark my words, etc. Buy Bitcoin, etc. Here's another. This is one of the most recent obituaries I could find. This is February 2024. Bitcoin has failed on the promise to be a global decentralized digital currency. Instead, it's used for illicit transactions. Just a little more so it's not just necessarily price, because February 2024, Bitcoin's got a pretty healthy price. But one of the other things that's correlated is your own self-interest. So this obituary was published by the European Central Bank in February 2024. And those two guys, Ulrich Beinzel and Jürgen Schaaf, who show up there, they're employees of the European Central Bank. So someone who might have an incentive to see Bitcoin dead. You notice a lot more. So another correlation, you've got self-interest, you've got previous Bitcoin obituaries. Another thing is price. So when the price has gone up a great deal and then comes down not as much as, not all the way back to where it started, then people pile on with the obituary. So January 2015, Bitcoin had been in 2014 around 1,000, 1,200, give or take, moving around in that area, and then it craters to $200, and people are like, ha! Especially people who had previously written a Bitcoin obituary when the price was like $50. Now they're like, I told you. Bitcoin is clearly dead now. It's a Ponzi. It's been a Ponzi all along. Is this the end of Bitcoin? Is one of my favorites. Questions to which the answer is no. So you can sort of plot the graph of Bitcoin obituaries, and we just have the solitary one. So they're getting fewer and fewer, which is good. Maybe people are learning. It's taken them a while, but maybe they're coming around. So this is from the book. This is another recent obituary, but it was just so perfect. We wanted to talk about this phenomenon in resistance money, about why people persistently criticize Bitcoin. And of course, there are a bunch of people. Paul Krugman has done this, over and over famously. But John Quiggin is an economist. He's Australian. And he's been criticizing Bitcoin for 12 years. In 2013, he said it was the most demonstrably valueless asset ever created. That was when Bitcoin was $68. So John Quiggin had a choice in April 16th, 2013. his choice was buy Bitcoin or say that Bitcoin is the most demonstrably valueless financial asset ever created. And he chose the latter. And in hindsight, one might wonder whether this was a good choice. And also one might wonder whether Quiggins' future comments were looking back and thinking, man, it would be really bad if I was wrong that Bitcoin is the most demonstrably valueless financial asset ever created, because that would mean I missed something. So it would be much better for me if I'm right eventually, if Bitcoin is eventually going to zero. Not now. A lot of people are deceived now. But eventually Bitcoin is going to go to zero. So he published this in 2013. He published again in 2015. Bitcoin should be well below $100 by the end of 2015, below $10 not long after that. In November 23rd, 2018, when the price had gone up 10 times into about 3,000, Quiggin remembered his 2013 claim when Bitcoin was $62 and said, ha, I was right. The 2013 claim I made that Bitcoin has a true value of zero is looking better and better as the price of Bitcoin is going up. So Bitcoin hasn't been below $3,000 since then. Has Quiggin learned his lesson? Well, he wrote last week on the blog Crooked Timber this like fiction of where the world might be going. It's sort of dystopian. You get the sense that he kind of wants it to be this way because that would mean he's right, but he's also pretty scared. And it's got a lot of stuff about Tesla and other things like that that are relevant to our purposes. But here's what he says about Bitcoin. The price fell 25% overnight. That's, by the way, that's nothing compared to Bitcoin's history, but whatever. Long-standing hodlers were not concerned. But here's how it would go if Bitcoin were to do that. They'd realize that economists who almost universally agreed that cryptocurrencies were inherently useless were right all along. We should have been listening to them. And now they're all going to get rid of their Bitcoin. Traders get a little bit nervous. Regulators start. So Quiggin he still seems to think, from between $62 and whatever it is today, $110,000, still fundamentally, Bitcoin is worth nothing. So how does this happen? I'm just kind of fascinated by the persistence of these obituaries, because the people who are writing them don't think that they're the first one who's ever proclaiming this. They know that there's a history of these, and they know that the Bitcoin price in dollar terms has just steadily gone up as these obituaries have been written. So what could motivate someone to write something like this? Now, maybe it's just clickbait, and that's possible. But I think a lot of people really do believe these. And so what could lead you to go down this path of criticizing Bitcoin repeatedly alongside other people who have been wrong about the price over and over again? So I think there are some things I teach in addition to stuff about Bitcoin here at the university. I also teach a course in critical thinking. And there's a lot of concepts from how we reason that can be helpful here. So if we note that obituaries are associated with A, previous obituaries, B, price drops, C, financial interests or self-interest, like in the case of the European Central Bank, and lost opportunities, we can identify some common critical thinking fallacies that show up here. So just detail some of these, and then if we have time at the end, suggest a better way that you might go about it. So number one is motivated reasoning. This is really familiar in self-deception, which occurs in the field of epistemology, which is in philosophy. And this is when you want to believe something and your desire that it be true comes to play an evidential role for you in coming to the belief. And it's not by itself being evidence. So suppose the classic example that's given in the self-deception literature is my partner is being unfaithful to me. You really don't want this to happen. But you don't say to yourself, I really don't want this to be true, so it probably isn't. It doesn't play that obvious of a role. Instead, what it does is it has you treat the evidence differently than you would if you wanted it to be true. So when you don't want something to be true, you take the evidence for it to be not very good evidence. You take the evidence against it to be really strong, and you sort of weigh the evidence in this motivationally biased way. And oftentimes, one of the things we learn from psychological research is that our motivations aren't always clear to us, and how we're weighing evidence isn't always clear to us. So this can go on under the surface. You don't necessarily know that this is what you're doing, engaging in motivated reasoning. And there's different ways of doing this. So one of the things that might motivate you is the sunk cost fallacy. This is where if you have already invested resources into something, you are less likely to stop doing it or withdraw from it than if you otherwise would have. So suppose you spend $1,000 on concert tickets, and by the time the night of the concert comes up, you have this like terrible migraine. Had the tickets been given to you, or had you had to buy them that night, you wouldn't buy them. You wouldn't even accept them for free. You'd rather stay home. But you think to yourself, wow, I already spent $1,000 on the tickets. I should probably go. And similarly, if you've already criticized Bitcoin, 1,000% ago, you might think, well, I've already made my views on Bitcoin known. I shouldn't let the price now influence my judgment, so I'll just double down. This, in fact, might even make me look smarter. I was criticizing Bitcoin at $60 after it had dropped 50%. How much more intelligent will I seem if I'm still criticizing at 60,000? Because I can see something nobody else can. So you can sort of justify the sunk costs to yourself. Obviously, there's also opportunity costs, right? If Quiggin had spent $1,000 on Bitcoin when it was $63, instead of saying Bitcoin is fundamentally the least valuable asset in the history of assets, then he would have 14 Bitcoin, and he would be living very comfortably right now. He gave that up, and so now he has to, if he ends up saying maybe I was wrong about Bitcoin, he has to reckon with this, and he has to admit that he gave up something of great value, namely the Bitcoin that he could have had, he bought at that time. Then we get into some more interesting things. So suppose this isn't necessarily someone who is motivated by price or having been wrong or their reputation or something like that. They just have this suspicion that, as most of it, I don't know how many of you heard about Bitcoin for the first time and thought, oh yeah, this internet money that's not backed by anything. Yeah, that sounds like a great thing to build a financial system. Most of us, it takes like a little bit of reading and research and hearing people talk about it and understanding the financial system and so on. And I think for a lot of people, the first thing we think is, that's not very important. And then if we hear about it again, we think, that sounds like a scam. And then we hear about it again and we think, maybe there's something to that. And then you keep hearing about it. So when you engage in confirmation bias, it happens again below the surface of reasoning, and it's where you notice evidence that supports your theory and you don't notice evidence that doesn't. So this isn't weighing evidence in a motivationally biased way. It's just not even taking something to be evidence. So here's an example that I give in the critical thinking class. Suppose you're convinced that you have ESP, extrasensory perception, for the following reason. When you think about people, they tend to get in touch with you shortly after that. You remember this one time in particular where you were thinking about someone you hadn't seen since high school, and then you got a Facebook message from them. This is support for my view that I have ESP. So a couple of things to note. It is support that you have ESP. If it's more likely that that would happen given that you have ESP than that you don't, then yes, it does count as some evidence that you have ESP. On the other hand, every time that you think about someone and they don't get in touch with you, that's evidence that you don't have ESP. But how often do you notice those and think, you know what? The other day I thought about my roommate from college and they didn't get in touch with me. That's weird. if I have ESP. Also, every time someone gets in touch with you who you haven't just been thinking about, that's also some evidence that you don't have ESP. So when we're engaging in confirmation bias, we're only noticing the things that are evidence for what we want to believe. And we just don't even realize all of the evidence against what we want to believe we are getting. And I think this is often happening in Bitcoin. The price goes up, people don't even notice, right? John Quiggin isn't sitting there watching the Bitcoin charts probably as it goes up and down, but a steep crash, that will show up on his radar and he'll think, Bitcoin crashed again. That's right. He won't notice every time Bitcoin goes up a little bit or even goes up a lot, because that's not going to confirm what he believes already. So here's one of the things I mentioned, one-sided strength testing. So this is when you test evidence that goes in favor of your theory, but you don't test evidence that goes against your theory. So a lot of people will insist, and in fact, I've had this conversation a few times, that the price of Bitcoin going down in dollar terms is evidence that Bitcoin is fundamentally worthless. It's people showing that they don't value Bitcoin by selling it. Now, it's a principle of probability theory that any evidence that confirms a theory, the absence of that evidence or the negation of that evidence confirms the negation of the theory. So if, and I'm not saying this is true, if it is true that the price of Bitcoin going down is actually evidence that Bitcoin is fundamentally worthless, then it follows as a matter of probability theory that the price of Bitcoin going up is evidence against that, is evidence that it is fundamentally valuable. But people just focus on one side of this. And the talk here is about Bitcoin obituaries, but you see this in exactly the opposite direction with some Bitcoiners, right? Every time the price goes up, they're like, yeah, Bitcoin's amazing. And then every time the price goes down, they're silent. Because they think that the price going up is evidence that Bitcoin is awesome. But they don't realize that if that's true, it follows from probability theory that the price going down is evidence against that. Belief perseverance. So this is a classic phenomenon that we can test in psychological research, where if you form a belief, then in the absence of any other evidence, you're likely to continue to hold the belief. Think about things that you learned when you were 5, 6 years old, interesting facts that you found out. And then, so for example, I learned at one point that you could see the Great Wall of China from space. It's the largest man-made object, or the only man-made object that you can see from space. I remember learning that. And I remember also vaguely learning along the way that that's not true. But this literally happened 2 days ago. My son was like, is the Great Wall of China the largest man-made object you can see from space? And I couldn't remember whether I had come to believe it and then found out I was wrong, or come to believe it and then found out I was right. And I was like, I don't know. Can you tell me? So clearly the early formation of the belief kept it going in me. And this can happen even in the presence of evidence to the contrary. It's easier to keep believing the things that we've believed before. You can give people, so you can test this, and they have psychologically, you can give people a list of facts about how dangerous firefighting is. And you can give them a test before you give them these facts, how dangerous they think firefighting is. Then you can give them a page-long list of facts about how dangerous it is. And you can let them think about it and talk about it for a bit. And then you can say, by the way, we made all those up. And then have them take the same test, and they will still rate firefighting as more dangerous than they did before they came in, on the basis of the evidence that they just learned was completely made up. So we just have this tendency to not revise our beliefs as often as we should, because it's hard. It takes some cognitive effort. Similarly, we tend to weigh the evidence that we get earlier as more important than the evidence that we get later. So you could meet someone at a party, terrible impression of them, and then they could do something nice for you later, and you'll tend to say, well, I bet that was just them being nice that one time. Whereas if they were nice at the party when you first met them, and then they did something mean to you later, you would excuse the mean behavior and say, oh, well, they must be having a bad day. This, again, goes on totally under the radar, but it's something that we always do. You can give people lists of adjectives that are positively and negatively valenced about someone. You can say, here, I just want to give you a list of adjectives that people use to describe Kathy, and you tell me if Kathy's a good person or a bad person. And if the negative adjectives come first, people will rate Kathy as a worse person than if the positive adjectives come first, even when it's exactly the same list, and they can just look at it in front of them. So if you start off believing that Bitcoin is bad and you get someone telling you early on it's a scam or it's a Ponzi or something, that evidence will weigh more heavily in your mind than evidence that you get later. Finally, we have this tendency to treat our beliefs as something that's ours, that we own. And because of that, we're loath to give them up. We want to defend them. We talk about this, in fact, we have to defend our beliefs. Beliefs are just sort of supposed to be getting at truth. And you don't get more points if you were right earlier. The point is to be right in the end. And yeah, once we come to a belief, then we try to, instead of thinking, I just want to find out what's true, we tend to think, I need to make what I believe true. I need to give it a defensiveness. And so, since very many people early on learn that Bitcoin is a scam, a Ponzi, a fraud, a greater fool, etc., or dangerous, something like that, they just tend to want to defend that view, especially if they've said it out loud to someone, published it, tweeted it, etc. And they'll do this without realizing that they have these biases. So one of the most nefarious things about all this kind of reasoning is that we don't know any of it is happening. We can identify it in other people really well, but in ourselves, not so much. And we tend to inflate our ability to do this. We think, if I were treating this in a biased way, I would know. And that's just fundamentally not how it works. So I'm done at 2:45, yeah. Okay, so I won't get into the better method too much, other than that it's reasoning behind the veil of ignorance, where you forget everything you've said about Bitcoin, all the prices, everything like that. You forget who you are in the world. You get rid of your political bias, your financial bias, your reputational bias, all these sorts of things, and imagine that you could be anyone in the world. And you think, what if I were that person who hasn't said anything about Bitcoin? Would I find Bitcoin valuable? And if you would, then maybe you're not treating the evidence in a totally fair way. So that's like chapter 3 of this book that I wrote. If you want more, you can buy the book. Thanks.